The first question that I would like to ask is that I think it was in Anthony's talk. He raised the idea of a social landscape. And I was wondering if the other two speakers, Barbara and Donlin, if you could comment on the parallels of a social landscape and what those values might mean in the examples that you brought up.
Well, there is a parallel, but also a difference. The social landscape, I mean, clearly in the examples we saw, there was really an interest in people sharing spaces. And that was wonderful. And it's so in that sense, there was the idea of the individual space, individual territory, and some shared territory. Well, that's fundamental to the whole conception of the Sea Ranch. It was meant to be a place where nature would be dominant, and part of it would be held in common, and part of it would be individual territories. I must say we were not as conscious or seeking as much the kind of little bits of social interaction that are really key to and produced by the work you were showing. It does happen with us too. I mean, actually, one of the most successful socializing places, as is often the case, was the car court. Yeah. People need to go there. They need to stop and exchange and watch out for each other, and so not run over each other. There's and there has been now. I'll be quick. I'm cutting a little bit too short because one of the aspects of the Sea Ranch, I was starting to say, well, everybody's a little bit over concerned about their privacy, but it's their privacy to be in touch with nature, right? So the nature is to be dominant. However, there is a bulletin that comes out every month, and its back page, its full back page, is a listing of volunteer groups for things or interest groups, bridge clubs, piano clubs. But the Native Plants Landscape group, the incredible volunteers that maintain those trails, and so on. So it has become something which has, in fact, generated community and has become a cause célèbre, if you will, for those people who buy into it. And you need to, this was structured into it that in the CC&Rs, there is a clause which says it must be assumed that people who are buying property here have an interest in maintaining the quality of the natural landscape. I paraphrased that. And, I think it actually says something retaining, keeping it as it is, which of course is actually not possible. But anyway, so anyway, that's one response. Yeah.
You know, in contrast to Ain with the social landscape as a kind of a progressive ideal of humanity where we're individual and we're group animals, I think of when Schindler moved here and you know, kind of exploded the idea in the Kings Road house of the nuclear family. I mean, each person has their own working space and studio. And in contrast to both those paradigms, Neutra's pinwheel plans of the single-family house, those divide areas of nature, kid space, adult space, service space, you know, public space, transitional space. Those pinwheels reached, you know, provided opportunities for these different kinds of spaces to be articulated and employed. And then I think of the Strathmore Apartments where there's 8 units on a hill. Many of you may have seen it in Westwood, but it's on a very steep hill. And it's much more about privacy given the verdant landscaping, but there's a communal core of stairways all the way down. So you do have opportunities to, you know, see one another, but it doesn't have this kind of rigorously enforced social landscape where you had later occupants taking down the hedges, which I thought was so fascinating that they got together and they said, we live in such a privatized society
really
in
great.
America. We're not used to sharing. And so I thought that was interesting. And I thought when you showed that house, and I love the examples of the later architecture that you showed in settling in, and you showed this, I thought, wonderful idea, and I forget who did it, but it was the house on the side. It was on this right-hand.
Oh, yes, yeah.
The house on the side, and it was
Right.
almost as though
Right.
it was saying, here, I can do what I want on this portion of the site, but I'm going to allow this collective view for the rest of you. And I thought that was one of the most generous ways to address a site.
Yeah.
It was marvelous.
It is really marvelous.
Yeah.
And then actually the not as distinguished architecturally house, the next one down, does the same thing. It moves over so that view channel can be maintained. I didn't include in the photograph the one on the left, which goes, across the view, which just didn't get the message.
So Anthony, in your presentation, you also elaborated quite a bit on the hierarchy of space between public and private, and I wondered if you could, sort of elucidate a little bit more on the on that aspect of the social landscape that you described.
I think what's really interesting is that it's the spectrum of spaces that move from a kind of private to a public and everything in between. It's not a simple distinction, but it's very, very subtle moves. I mean, the idea, for example, in Park Plan in 1945, when he simply places that garden right between two property lines. I mean, this is a very subtle move that kind of suggests things.
Subversive.
It suggests, but it doesn't. It's not emphatic. And I think it's the same way about a lot of his spaces that suggests even the backyard, the private, but it's always murky lines.
Well, I think what was really interesting was that while there is a repetitive nature of the architecture itself, that there, through the landscape and this incredible attention paid to detail and designing of the landscape and the curatorial aspects of it, that there's actually, these are highly sophisticated spaces, which, the landscapes are integral to the architecture, obviously. So I wondered if you could, just sort of comment on that a little bit, because that really came through in your presentation with all the images that you showed, and how, in many cases, people had actually chosen to kind of respect that order in a way, sort of unintentionally, but maybe it was intentional.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe before even saying that, we were talking earlier, Kyle and I think what's interesting to look at in these historical examples is what has been tampered with and what has not. And it might be an indication that things that are tampered with might have certain problems, where things that are not tampered with seems to have survived a kind of test of multiple users that seem, and it's back to this question that it's something that sort of works in the simplest language, but it has been so well resolved, but not intrusive at the same time. Something that is highly resolved, but not, it doesn't demand, but it's just a highly resolved. And I see that in the relationship between, certainly in the kind of built to unbuilt, the garden, the use of kind of gardens, the use of the different scales of garden or landscape at various ways of thinking about that.
Barbara, you also commented on the scale of the gardens with the relationship to the architecture and how Neutra was thinking about usable spaces. Maybe you could comment on that a little bit more.
I was just thinking of the idea of nature. Neutra believed that nature, we were part of nature and on the same spectrum and not distinct. So it wasn't, it was not man versus nature. So maybe another kind of larger umbrella for this social landscape was kind of clearly expressed by your columns, your wood poles that invited nature in, and therefore kind of more directly related human to nature. And it also recalled a cabin by John Lautner, right, which has got very similar, not the Bob Hope concrete wunderkind stuff,
Right.
but very humble, humbleness, humility.
Donald, perhaps you...
Let me just say one more thing about that particular house, which I didn't mention. It turns out one of the owners comes from India, and she had brought many years ago from India some carved wooden panels from her father's house. And she said, well, could we find a place to put these? And I said, yes, we could. And they screen the living space from the bedroom space. But the incredible thing is that little intricate Indian carved pattern is like the ferns in the forest. So that it actually has these two dimensions of bringing the forest inside. That's not my doing, but it's a certain wonderful thing of when people are able to and feel empowered to bring things of their own into some place and live with it there. It makes it all so much richer, just as the things in Charles Moore's unit do and so on.
Well, this is getting a little farther afield, but that recalls then Frank Lloyd Wright's perfs, those clear story panels in Usonian houses that were abstractions of the landscape beyond, or even the De Young Museum where Herzog and Demeron have abstracted landscapes and employed those landscapes in pixelated patterns for the copper skins. So those are also ways of integrating, bringing nature into humanscape.
Sorry, you started asking.
Yeah,
perhaps you could just talk a little bit more about the protective mechanisms that have been in place. You mentioned the Design Review Board.
Yeah, I
at
think
Sea
it's
Ranch,
important.
and I know you didn't have a lot of time to go into this, but I think it's important to really talk about that because those are mechanisms that are in place that help manage change with the Sea Ranch and allows the complex to sustain itself as well. So
the design committee was first thought about. Well, the question as to whether to have a design committee was first thought about when we were first working on the projects. And Halprin has some notes somewhere, in fact, in a little book he's published that he took from the time, saying, should we have a stable of architects who are going to make it all the right way? Or should we have design review that works with anybody who comes? And all of us were uncomfortable with the idea of a stable of architects. Some later thought maybe that was a mistake, but anyway, because there've been, I showed you some good stuff. It's not all like that. But it was then thought there needed to be a design review process. But the crucial thing is that design review process is not political. The board of the association appoints the design committee for 3-year periods, but they have no ability to override the design committee. The design committee's decisions are theirs, and they have the judgment about whether any building goes forward. And that's also something that goes through a process. The buildings are reviewed at 3 stages. There's a conceptual, we're going to do this, and yes, it's okay, it sounds like a good idea, or no, don't you think you ought to try something else? And then there's a review, and then there's another 3rd review to make sure it's done what it said it was going to do. That's been in place from the beginning. It has, at times, as you can imagine, been not entirely loved by the people working with it. In fact, all too often, people just, architects coming in, especially from outside, get incensed by the idea that their judgment should be questioned by anybody. What's happened actually over time is that there was a period when the design committee got a lot of heat. And there was even a period when the board started trying to kind of see if they couldn't get in there some. And that was driven off. And once it was, the design committee has come back to being something really valued by the community.
I heard you mention that you actually also implemented workshops
Yes.
in each of the sections to
Yes,
help
that's
the
that's what we've
owners
done with-
understand. And I think that maybe you could explain that a little bit.
That's what
because
we've
I
done
think
with the Commons.
That might parallel some
Yeah.
of the other homeowner associations.
That's what we've done with the Commons Landscape Committee. That's not the Design Committee, but the Commons Landscape Committee. All these management plans for all that commons. Every area, the 10 areas, has had 3 workshops. One is a workshop to reintroduce people to their area. And parts of it they haven't seen before, because these are big areas. You know, it's 10 miles of coast, so it's roughly a mile per. Those are 5-hour workshops, and they have some introduction by us of things we've already noticed. We take people on tours in groups of 6 or 8, and there's a docent who talks about several spots along the way. Then there's discussion of what they found, what they care about, what are the issues they're worrying about. We take all that, and then we make a set of very general proposals for the next workshop. And those are taken up, and then those are discussed in detail. And
I would imagine that you orient them with the management plan, with the ins and outs of the management plan.
And then we take that all and put it into a final draft plan, and that goes before a workshop for modification and approval. And then it is presented to the design committee. The design committee has to approve that too. And so far, the design committee has each time sent a letter saying how really wonderful and valuable it is that we're doing this close look at the thing and getting a kind of idea about what it's like, and it's really helping them a lot.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I also think it's interesting, this idea of a kind of collective management that is almost necessitating this idea of the commons. And I think that's part of, even today in some of these environments with Ain, it's park plan homes, from what I've discussed with some of the residents, it's very interesting that as one learns more and more, by studying what the original plan was, it just encourages a kind of collective participation in, again, the streetscape in the case of Ain. And I guess it's those kinds of models that I find really interesting, that both allows one, again, the privacy or the individual effort, and at the same time, it's constantly moving beyond. I mean, for one of the main issues that Ain struggled with, and he's made that explicit, is the idea of the single-family house on a private lot, and that had become the American model. He was explicitly trying to challenge this model and offer something. And in many ways, I think he offers a kind of paradigm that today the city, looking at new forms of density, looking at how we can start to share resources, the kind of overlap of existing resources, as we were speaking, as opposed to the constant repetition of the same front yard. What happens when you start to share those resources? I think those are super exciting things to revisit today, and I think Sea Ranch has a lot of that mechanism in place to kind of open up these kinds of discussions.
1 lawnmower instead of 5.
For example.
Right.
We should have.
Well, in the interest of, we're out of time, so perhaps we could take some questions from our audience. We have one microphone here, so if you've got a question, just raise your hand and she'll come to you. Okay, I've got a question over here. Yes, please state your name and then
My name
state your
is
question.
Judy Thompson. I'm married to an architect. For the Gregory Ain, speaking of conservation, in Mar Vista, for instance, what measures are in place to conserve that atmosphere and environment.
I'm sorry.
What mechanisms are in place at Mar Vista?
Well, you know, the historic preservation overlay zone has been established, and it's pretty detailed in the way. Again, I'm not an expert in it, but it's pretty detailed in the way it kind of covers a full range of issues to do with altering, you know, the alteration of houses, et cetera, et cetera. I guess for me, the issue, it also, to some degree, protects the kind of existing landscape as it is. I think the question is what happens with that landscape as it transforms over time, and you got into a little bit.
Right.
I mean, landscape is anything but static, and what does it actually mean to try to preserve a landscape? Furthermore, I think issues of, if in the 1940s certain plants were specified in the plan, for me it raises interesting questions with the new interest in ecological kind of urbanism or planning. Should one transform the fundamental, or hold on to the fundamental concept of what this social landscape is, yet imagine that new kinds of plants could be introduced? So it raises just these fundamental questions. Is it about preserving this existing kind of original idea, or is it understanding the basic principles and allowing that to drive or guide a kind of new way of moving forward?
One of the things that many of you have probably already seen is that the Association for Mar Vista actually, on their website, provides a lot of information about, you know, the different planting typologies, the inventory of plants. In fact, they go so far as to key what types of plants are actually supposed to be located on the original plan, and it's very interactive. So there's a lot of information that they make available, not only to their own community, but people outside that as an example of how, you know, to look at some of these issues. So just wanted to add that.
Next question up here.
Yes, up at the top.
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you for three fascinating talks. I feel like I ought to ask a conservation question, but I actually have an architectural one. In the Ain work, we saw a 4-foot buffer, which really sort of mediates between the interior and the exterior. We were talking a great deal about inside to outside. You see something of the same thing in the deck, the linear deck on the Neutra, and I'm struck by the on condominium 1, these sort of saddlebags, these sort of bays projecting out, also in that same sort of mediating zone between inside and outside. And I wonder if you could sort of speak to the commonalities there.
I think you already have.
But I think it's a very interesting issue that you're picking up on. In fact, I was thinking it's pretty clear that in Neutra's case, there's always this zone, and one could call it this kind of mediating zone. It's not just about the interior and exterior, it's about sunshade. There's a whole range of things. And in the case of Ains and Dunsmuir, you also see that it's a zone that's one's allowed to tamper with the actual structure. You put different kinds of material for the brise soleil. So it's the one place that, unlike the fixed interior built-in furniture, it's a place that's very open-ended, and I thought that's very interesting as well.
Well, in fact, at the Kaufman Desert House, there's a very famous example where Barry Manilow was living in the house. He extended out that east bedroom so that you lost that interstitial space created by the extended roof overhang. But I was just thinking, even as Neutra accepted the paradigm of the single family, more or less, where he does express social housing or social concerns is in his schools. And because he was a revolutionary when it came to school designs, and in his little-known defense housing, which he did all over the United States, which hardly nobody knows about and nobody's written about. But he would argue too.
There's actually one in Watts I just saw and learned.
Well, they're
Neutra
all
has
over the country, they have been. But the idea of he used to argue that if you extended a roof overhang for classroom space, you would be doubling classroom space. So you could argue to a building official or somebody that you had actually doubled that space, and that was ambivalent space, ambiguous space, so that children had a place to play in the rain, and as well as that extended overhang. And I just remember that, Albert Frey in his Palm Springs house, he had, I guess, made sundials so that he could actually assess where the sun was going to be and extend the overhang, in this very kind of, manual labor kind of way. He also tested trusses by hanging off them. So, that was great.
And Donna, in the case of Sea Ranch, the protruding, that zone that protrudes out, what was the main driver behind those kinds of
Well, actually,
moves?
the basic idea of the thing is that there's a major enclosure which is basically cubic. The original site plan, in fact, was done with sugar cubes.
Was it really?
Yes.
Totally Larry there.
And that then you wanted that kind of, and it's a very windy climate. And so you wanted a place inside that was protected. And then, as I said, we had kind of glass box outside, which is going to be where you got the sun, and sort of it was one of these kind of zones, but it was also cubic since we'd just come out of Lucan. But anyway, and then that became much too diagrammatic. And so we actually then started making the protrusions, moving out. And it was specifically about moving beyond the major definition to be in an intermediate zone and right on the edge of the outside. So we wrote a little bit about, being on the very edge of the ocean, very edge of the outside, that it was an intermediate space beyond the main one. Now, some of those are bays. There's one that's a greenhouse, which turns out not to have been a very good idea. Although actually that's interesting too, because originally it had one curtain dropping down, and then somebody got exercised about covering all the glass, and so they made this kind of solid canvas pyramid out of it instead of something that came and went with as it was needed. Anyway, and then there were several that were courtyards. And the courtyards really do that intermediate space in a good way, although nobody would be sympathetic to the idea of building into them. But the zone was to provide a different kind of experience of this inside relationship still, but on the edge of the outside.
Interesting.
Thank you.
It all comes, in our case, that's also part of the whole sort of Team 10, Alda Van Eyck, Smithson kind of stuff that was in our minds when we were doing this.
Well, thank you. We are out of time. So I wanted to say thank you to all the speakers and applaud them.
Thank you for putting it together.
Thank you.